and what they see over the next decade to come, we are joined by Liisa. She's the Chief National Security Cyber Risk Officer at Estonia's National Security and Defense Coordination Unit in Tallinn. Also, we have Neil Walsh, Chief of the UN Cybercrime, Anti-Money Laundering, and Counterfinancing of Terrorism Department in Vienna. Next, we have the Honorable Michael Chertoff, Chairman and co-founder of the Chertoff Group, and the second ever U.S. Secretary of Homeland Security, joining us from Washington, D.C. Finally, we have Ali Soufan, Chairman and CEO of the Soufan Group, and former FBI counterterrorism agent, joining us from New York. And I'm Kim Dozier, a Time Magazine contributor and CNN analyst from Washington, D.C. So I want to start with our thoroughly spread panel, asking you all to tell us one thing, or a brief series of things, that you want everyone in the audience to do right now or right after this panel to make sure that they're keeping themselves and their families safer from cybercrime. Why don't you go first, Liisa? In that case, why don't we go to Neil?
Thanks, Kim. Good evening, everybody from Vienna. So what can we do to keep ourselves safe, to keep our families safe online? Couple of simple things. The number of attacks from criminals and even from states is increasing all the time. We've seen it even increasing significantly during our lockdown due to COVID. So a couple of simple things you can do. Update your software, whichever you use on your phone and your computer. Make sure it has the most up-to-date operating system on it. Do it right after this broadcast. And also make sure that if you're using Bluetooth, for example, turn it off if you're not actually connected to any device. Reduce the attack vector that the bad guys and the bad girls will use to try and get access to your device. And if something happens, if you feel like there is something wrong with your device, get it checked, run anti-malware, antiviral software, and trust your own instinct. If there's something wrong, get it checked out.
Got it. Liisa, do you want to jump in with your recommendations to the audience?
Sure, the recommendations would very much be in line with what Neil already said. You know, if a link looks funny, it probably is. Even if it looks like it's legitimate, you know, we all have been trained to spot sort of spear phishing, but we've not been trained to spot really well social engineered spear phishing that's been designed to target you, the particular person, looking like it's coming from a business acquaintance, a family member, or anyone. So, you know, accept that you might have to call and check if someone sent you an email, even if it looks legitimate. Update the software, two-factor authentication, all of that already has been mentioned. But I think most fundamentally, people need to accept that there's no 100% privacy in the digital world, and there's no 100% security. You can take steps to mitigate probably the 97% of the risks, but it's not binary the way it's in the physical world.
There's still that 10%. Ali, what would you recommend?
I think two areas. First of all, we have a problem now with online radicalization. As you know, there's 2 billion people connected, to gaming, for example, and a lot of terrorist groups and white supremacist organizations are using the gaming industry and the gaming culture in order to recruit people and find a new member and provide them with alternative narratives. Also, in the same time, I think we have other terrorist organizations and violent groups also still advocating their jihadi narrative, their racial narrative, their economic narrative, whatever it is. Second, modern disinformation. Modern disinformation, including the disinformation terrorism nexus. Now it's being used by states and by non-state actors. And they are effective, they are cheap to destabilize society. Based on these two things, and especially with a lot of people now sitting online because of the pandemic, I think two things. Please have conversations with your children. have conversation with your children about their online habits. Even if they are doing something innocent, like playing a video game, it is important to know if they are talking to strangers, if these applications are suspicious, what these strangers are saying to them. And second, before we used to have, if you see something, say something. Now I think we need a new slogan. It's think before you link. And this is how you deprive state actors and non-state actors from sharing and disseminating disinformation and false narratives.
Well, that leads us to Secretary Chertoff. So you were one of the people behind the See Something, Say Something movement. What would you tell people?
Well, I agree with all the suggestions that have been made so far. I think what I would add is this. These days, your personal data can be weaponized and used either against you or against your friends and associates. I mean, part of the way people do the phishing is they do research and they get enough information about what it is you are interested in, what it is you're doing, to be able to create a credible false front that they can use then to attack you or attack others. So I would say, before you share data online or engage in transactions online, think about whether you really want to do it. What is the risk? How reliable is the enterprise you're sharing with or the website you're going to? And is there a way to get the same result but share less data or do it in a way in which the data ultimately doesn't get maintained? And of course, I would then also say encryption. What are the principal ways we secure ourselves these days to ensure our data in motion and our data at rest? So those tools that allow you to communicate with encrypted messaging are very advantageous in the current environment.
So turn on your password keeper, two-factor authentication, and turn off your sharing of your entire Facebook network and your entire LinkedIn network. Practical things that bad actors search for information from to target you.
Correct.
Got it. Well, I'd like to move into how those bad actors are taking advantage of the pandemic right now. Now, Ali mentioned how terrorists use gaming to groom potential recruits. But Neil, you also have dealt with this in the trafficking realm. What are you seeing related to, especially the pandemic, online?
Thanks, Kim, and I agree entirely with what Ali, Liisa, and Michael said. What we've seen through our private sector colleagues and government partners since the start of the pandemic, there has been, without doubt, a significant growth of online child sexual exploitation. And I think one of the most disturbing parts of that is around 50% of child sexual abuse material online now is self-generated. It's kids sitting there with a smartphone, with a tablet, with a laptop, taking sexualized pictures of themselves, uploading them, sometimes unwittingly, and then sharing that material. So that creates the risk of them being unfairly criminalized, but also being exploited through a long period of their life. Yes, correct. Yeah, blackmail can be happening there as well. Yeah.
And you've seen a rise of that during the pandemic because so many people are at home, and it's like it seems like parents think it can't happen to their kids.
I think that's a great point, that there is this, I think when people are at home, we are psychologically more vulnerable because we feel safer. We're in our domain that we feel comfortable in. We know where everything is. We think we're okay. And we take risks online that we wouldn't do if we were sitting in the workplace or at school. So we need to maintain that level of suspicion, that level of awareness. And I think, as Ali was saying, really instill that into our kids from the earliest of ages.
Now, Liisa, in Estonia, I know from past Leonard Mary conferences, you all spend a lot of time looking at nation-state actors, specifically Russia, but also others. What are you seeing in terms of trends during this pandemic? Who is taking advantage of this and how?
So I think in terms of the pandemic, nothing's new and everything's new at the same time. So in many census for Estonia and, governments and organizations in our corner of the world, it has been business as usual. The transition to remote work, whilst almost overnight in a lot of places, was quite smooth since the infrastructure is in place. We have a government-backed secure digital identity, all of that.
Well, especially in Estonia, which is known as Estonia for a reason, right?
Absolutely. However, we also know, looking at whichever of the past the nation state backed or at least politically motivated cyber attack campaigns, it's clear that that attacker is opportunistic and reactive, which means that, of course, that sort of an attacker takes advantage of any sort of opportunity. And in particular, the opportunistic attacker tried to mix geopolitics and the pandemic to delegitimize the ways democratic governments were dealing with a pandemic, and those news popped up all around the world. And
could you give us an example of that?
Any case of mask diplomacy that you ever saw, masks landing with a flag from countries that weren't quite themselves reporting events. There's a fair amount of finger pointing that happens specifically early in the pandemic, but also it died down as everyone realized what a deep global mess we're in. But what continued worldwide was taking teaching and impersonation. So North American government agencies as well as
what?
Taking advantage of the pandemic for spear phishing and impersonation. So particularly governments that had some sort of aid packages, whether it was the US, a payout to certain groups of citizens, whether it was Australian aid packages, there was a lot of spear phishing around that, very well designed, very well targeted emails made you look like they're from the government who's here to give you money. And thirdly, I think for the Intel community, the methods, tools, and techniques were new, or were old rather, but attack vectors or the attack surface might have been new since no one really was preparing for a wide-scale global attempt of trying to steal IP when it comes to medical research, vaccine development, things like that. And it makes so much sense that in a global pandemic where there's a single focusing item on the agenda and there's a race to develop solutions, that spies are going to spy.
So you're talking about the reports by U.S. officials and others that Russia and other actors have tried to steal some of the intellectual property around vaccine development to fight COVID, things like that.
Exactly. And Russia and China are the two that have been named specifically. It's clear that if it wasn't a vaccine in a pandemic, it would be designs in the defense industry. So in a way, it's spies are going to spy, but then there's an extra added layer of this acute and pressing issue of a global pandemic that's focusing it into this particular area.
Now, Secretary Chertoff, I know, yes, ma'am.
I just have to add that medical technology is notoriously non-secure. It's not safe. It has the longest patch cycles in the world of any industry that I'm familiar with. In fact, there's plenty of medical technology, including life-saving devices, that have well-known and quite well-researched vulnerabilities, where the CVE number starts with 19, meaning they were first noticed and registered in a year that started with 19 in the previous century. So one of the silver linings of this, I guess, is that there wasn't a lot of attacks against life-saving medical technology, which is actually often insecure and often full of vulnerabilities, since there's a race to obviously to go out and save lives rather than secure technology itself.
So I was going to turn to Michael Chertoff to ask you, you must have been watching the early attempts by China and others to steal intellectual property to start spreading disinformation. Those were the early years of China's AI, artificial intelligence campaign. What sort of evolution have you seen?
Well, I think we've seen a number of things. Obviously, Chinese espionage has been going on for quite some time, and not just traditional national security espionage, but commercial espionage to help their state-supported enterprises, and that continues. What we've seen more recently is the Chinese have identified artificial intelligence as an area they want to have global primacy in. And the way you build that is you combine developing algorithms with huge amounts of data. And we've seen some massive data thefts. In my view, I think many of these actually are generated by China. We had the theft of millions of files on background checks from the U.S. Office of Personnel Management. We've seen Yahoo accounts and other accounts being stolen at a scale that would be useless for human beings to review, but are exactly the kind of grist for building artificial intelligence. So I think there is a concern that the Chinese are building a very comprehensive profile of all Americans and maybe citizens of a lot of other countries. And this can be used as a way of social engineering. It can be used as a way of promoting impersonation, but it can also be used to target political messaging. And although the Russians have been the principal actors in the disinformation field, particularly as it applies to trying to affect elections, I think we're going to see the Chinese doing more of this, particularly to elevate their own brand globally at the expense of the way people are looking at the Western democracies.
So, Ali, you have been the subject of a disinformation attack. Can you tell us what happened to you and how did you fight back?
Well, thanks. Early May, I was briefed by entities in the intelligence community here in the United States about a credible threat from a terrorist organization, from Al-Qaeda. And a few short weeks after that, I found myself on the receiving end of a sophisticated disinformation campaign. And it was targeting my career when I was in the FBI, targeting my character. And worse still, the disinformation campaign was utilizing a lot of the false narratives and a lot of the dangerous imagery that was communicated to me by the government, by the intelligence community about the threat itself. So we started to do our own investigation, but at the same time, the FBI and others in the US government did their own investigation as well. And we found out that the social media campaign against me have horrific similarities, if you want to call it, with the campaign that targeted Jamal Khashoggi. It included the same people, the same accounts, that survived Twitter removing accounts every now and then. And we were able to connect the campaign itself to accounts linked to Saudi Arabia and the Saudi government.
And of course, Jamal Khashoggi was the dissident, Saudi dissident turned opinion writer for the Washington Post, who was killed inside the Saudi consulate in Turkey.
Right. So given the timing of the threat information that I was received from the government and the highly coordinated campaign, it was really kind of, impossible or even irresponsible not to consider that the possibility that the campaign, the social media campaign and the threat might be connected to each other. And this is what the US government continued to investigate. And I think that they found a lot of really good results throughout their investigation so far. And it won't be the same where we see a state actor and non-state actors directly or indirectly trying to, either incite each other or promote a narrative against an individual. In this case, it's me. So one of the things that we notice in the campaign that the Saudis are using is basically copied from the Russian information campaign. First of all, you have a lot of false information. Somebody put false allegation out there. This is kind of the honey that attract the electronic bees or the electronic flies to come over and try to echo these narratives. And then you have people who make short videos about them or memes about them and put them out. And then you will try to take it to the mainstream by having verified Twitter accounts tweeting this misinformation and disinformation. And when these are tweeted, then you will have legitimate media organizations. In this case, all of it were in the Arab world because the campaign was so obviously filled with lies that it won't fly in America for anybody to write about it or in the English-speaking world to write about it. They put it in their own...
Because journalists in the West would have to source that information without just picking up a social media post.
Well, absolutely. Like, for example, when they say that I was involved in torturing every Arab in American jails, I was involved in a conspiracy by the Obama administration and by the Trump administration to destroy the Muslim world, that all the problems that's happening in Libya or in Somalia or in Syria was going through me, and there are funders in the Middle East.
Did you know you were that powerful, Ali?
I didn't, but I was telling my wife, hey, you better listen to me. Look how powerful I am on social media. She did not care, but
No. So before we move on, I wanted to ask if U.S. officials have yet confirmed to you if they think it's definitely a nation-state actor as opposed to Al-Qaeda.
I don't want to say what the United States government is telling me about the disinformation campaign and the investigation on the disinformation campaign, but we know that there's two different investigations happening at the same time: the disinformation investigation and the foreign influence investigation and the terrorism investigation, which is a threat from Al-Qaeda. And how these two meet each other, and I'm not ready to speak about it at this point. It's an ongoing investigation.
So I just wanted to let the audience know that we're going to shortly take questions. So if you could please start sharing questions to the chat. But I wanted to pivot to Neil and ask how this disinformation is being used by criminal networks or terrorist networks, and how that's making your job harder.
It's a great question, Kim, and I wish there was an easy answer to it. I think the sheer scale that we've seen of misinformation and disinformation is beyond what anyone expected. So if we look, there is a broad campaign within the UN called Verified, which is trying to get the public to really think about the sourcing chain of what they read online. Do you believe straight away what you read? Can you independently verify the origin of what you're reading on social media or on the news or anywhere else? And I think, as Ali was saying, sometimes even when this is generated from verified accounts, so on Twitter or Facebook, and you've got that blue tick beside you, that doesn't necessarily mean that the information that one's reading is true. So a lot of what we're doing in the UN now is actually focusing on kids and teenagers at school and those going into college and university, and focusing very much on giving them better skill set they're reading and making critical thinking decisions about how they react. And I think sometimes we think, well, this is primarily a Western problem or a economically developed problem, but it hits every country where you have 3G, 4G, 5G connection. And we need to make sure that our kids from the earliest ages and our teachers and educators understand how to better help our kids and our teenagers to get their way through lives and help to make those decisions about what they're reading is true and how not to share misinformation unintentionally and to share disinformation intentionally, because the impact is extreme.
It sounds almost like something that needs to be part of an education curriculum from the earliest age, as part of the STEM education in the US or something like that.
A couple of days ago, my staff in Honduras had 5,000 teachers online and explaining cybersecurity as part of a 5-week training course. So we've got around 20% of the teachers in that country skilled up on what these risks are. But that's one country out of 193. So we need to make this routine. It has to be part of the education curriculum, and it has to be a normal life skill that our kids have as they go through their life cycle. If we're only addressing this when they're in high school or university, we are way too late.
Now, I'd like to turn to a live question from our global audience. Could we get your question?
Hi, my name is Hans Schindler. I'm the Senior Director of the Counter-Extremism Project, one of the partner organizations of GlobeSec. And I wanted to go back to the issue of the operational use of social media and internet service by terrorist organizations. It's been quite a few years, clearly, that these services have become an integral part of any terrorist organization, whether it's extreme right-wing or Islamist. And we have not seen the compliance of companies really significantly making a dent into this misuse. Now, outside monitoring by internet referral unit, police units, users is really important, but it cannot really be the solution given the vast amount of data that is uploaded. So the companies have to be part of the solution. What would a sensible government regulation look like that would incentivize the strengthening of compliance systems, especially at global platforms?
So who would like to dig into that one?
Before the gentleman addressed
Liisa.
the what, I think it's important to recognize that the compliance mechanism and the policy itself that's addressing the global platforms cannot be a national one, but rather it's one where like-minded nations, be it through the European Union that's making great strides with the Digital Services Act, with by now we understand what the infamous GDPR actually does, the Network Information Security Directive, or be it through other international alliances, is where we can really create norms and be an equal partner to these platforms, because frankly, any national market, with the exception of perhaps a few of the largest countries in the world, is simply too small for these tech giants, these global tech giants, to take their national policies incredibly seriously.
Yeah, so as long as there are no rules, the bad actors around the world can take advantage of that. But it seems I've been to a lot of discussions where international standards are talked about, but nobody seems to want to take the first leap. So perhaps if you want to do business with the EU, you've got to meet their standards. That could help.
I think a couple of things we can do on these issues. Countries in their own national security strategy, they should emphasize that disinformation is a significant threat to them, and then all agencies need to start to work in accordance with the national security strategy. For example, also, government should criminalize the use of malicious deepfakes. There is no reason for it not to be criminalized and dealt with accordingly. In the United States, I think we should also consider aggressively using sanctions against foreign-based individuals and entities that are waging malicious disinformation campaigns against our citizens, against our governments, against our communities, and against our people. Congress should consider adopting Sanction Disinformation Act. And I know that some people in Congress are talking about something like this that aimed to provide the State Department and the Treasury Department with all the legal authorities to sanction individuals and to sanction organizations that are engaged in malicious disinformation and misinformation activities. So there's a lot of
and sadly, it seems it's going to take a disinformation 9/11 of some sort to bring people together. But I do want to pivot back to the question of how terrorists are taking advantage. Neil, did you have thoughts on that?
I think broadly, Kim, and listening to what Ali said as well, there are discussions throughout the UN and a number of processes in the General Assembly that look at what state-based cyber norms may be. But they are exceptionally difficult. There is so much geopolitical split on that finding areas of consensus are really quite challenging. In terms of the terrorism space and the broader crime space, back to what we've already heard, the sheer availability of information out there that people willingly upload makes their job, their role as criminals or terrorists, exceptionally easy to do. So it comes back again to how much data do we put out there? How do we manage those risks ourselves? And I don't think we're having a great enough discussion on that initial point of prevention, that we're trying to put a sticking plaster on a broken leg and actually considering why are we putting so much data out there. There is also a great role on internet service providers globally and communication service providers to be more involved in this. And we are, through the Secretary General of the UN, his digital cooperation roadmap, we are trying to do that. But I wish there was an easy solution to it. And I'm not sure there is yet. I'm really keen to hear the views of others and those who are listening to this as well.
Secretary Chertoff, it seems, you guys started the fight early on to try to find how terrorists were using the internet. But it does seem from the outside looking in that every time you get Facebook or Twitter or, name the app to police their network better, that the terrorists just migrate to somewhere else.
Well, that's true. There's a whole darknet that creates platforms that people can use to, plan and plot and instruct people how to carry out terrorist acts. I would say this, though. I would say one of the things that we ought to look at with the social media platforms is use of algorithms that tend to drive people deeper into radicalization. What happens in many cases is people will go to a site that, or they may search looking for a perfectly reasonable answer to a question, a curiosity about, let's say, Islamic religion or some political movement. But the algorithms, which are designed for commercial purposes to increase the degree of engagement and intensity by users, will then start to recommend increasingly extreme versions of the subject matter that the person was looking at. And for some people, that winds up luring them into a level of engagement and intensification with extremist ideologies. And the value of these algorithms is frankly purely commercial. It's designed to make you buy stuff. So that may be an area that we need to work on regulating, particularly when it deals with subject matter that is political. I know some of the platforms are talking about that. On the other hand, I would say this.
So the commercial algorithms don't end up helping someone who's on the fence to find radicalization.
Well, what it does is it kind of it begins to feed them, potential opportunities to look at things that are more and more radical, because the algorithm is trying to get more engagement and more intense activity online. The reason the algorithm is designed is for commercial purposes, but it winds up being used for nefarious purposes. The other thing I would say is we've got to be a little careful on regulating disinformation, because one person's disinformation is another person's free speech. And given that we now have some people in government labeling anything critical as, quote, fake news, giving the government the ability to regulate, quote, fake news could be something that would be celebrated in Beijing, but not necessarily good for liberal democracies.
We're seeing that right now with the Thai group that's critical of the monarchy that Facebook has now kicked off of Facebook, at least the original group has been. A question from the audience for Ali from Andrei Matishak, I believe. When talking about online jihadi radicalization, there is usually also an added factor from the physical world. The jihadi radicalization is seldom totally an online process. So my question to Ali, but also for anyone else, is this the same with the far-right radicalization? In the case of aspiring jihadis, the added factor from the physical world is usually an already radicalized individual. With the far right, is that also how it works?
Yeah, absolutely. We see that with the far right as well. There is always a bridge from the cyber sphere to the physical sphere. They do events. They go and celebrate Hitler's birthday from all across the Western world, frankly. Now, many of these white supremacist extremists from the United States, from Canada, from Australia, from New Zealand, from every European countries, and Globsec did a lot of research also on these elements. They go to Ukraine and they fight in Ukraine. So Ukraine is the white supremacist version of what Afghanistan used to be for the jihadis in the 90s. So yes, definitely there is a bridge, and exactly like the question mentioned with the jihadis and the physical world, also we have verified accounts, and we have real individuals who basically promote these narratives and the conspiracy theories that's happening in the real world, and they piggyback on other conspiracy theories in order to promote their narrative. So we're having that narrative, as I mentioned in the case against me with the threat and the disinformation, going from the cyber sphere to the physical sphere through media entities and through real individuals that are bringing it to life. Yeah, absolutely. There's always that bridge for any disinformation operation or any recruitment to be realistic and to be effective.
Neil or Liisa, did you have anything to add to that?
Oh, good.
So we're going to the next question. This one is from Carl Cox. How can artificial intelligence and machine learning actually help us to combat cyber attacks? Who can take a stab at that?
So the fundamental problem with machine learning and AI in any setting is that it's only as good as its training data.
So what does that mean?
If what goes into your machine learning system or into your system that uses AI in a security setting, if the outcome can never be better than the quality of the input, the training data. So if what goes in includes, it has human error in it, you know, there's a lot of talk about using these sorts of systems in responding to cyber attacks. And I'm cautious because these systems they can only be trained on events of the past, which means the response can't be any better than the human response of the past. But there are a few things where I think there's space for AI or machine learning in security. The first of them is triage, prioritizing events before a human reviews them. Any complex system can easily have tens of thousands of vulnerabilities and can see thousands of actions against them in a month. Most of them are just people passing by a global sort of events. And it's really hard for a human to review these, sometimes thousands, sometimes tens of thousands of events and vulnerabilities. And based on past human prioritization, machines can speed up the triage process a fair bit, where I'm very hopeful. And secondly, in a similar way, I'm very hopeful for that to happen in the information space. Because in NATO languages, and it's hard to rely on human researchers to sort of go through what might possibly be illegitimate external meddling in our information space, and then compare it across national boundaries to see if it's a wider sort of campaign. That will take, even with very dedicated researchers, months, most likely years. And by that time, we moved on from being able to respond to a real-time event. So sort of machine learning combined with translation, automatic translation, I'm really hopeful will help us spot this sort of information operations that are global, but because they happen across languages and cultures, we don't get to spot until later otherwise. So
in the 3 minutes or so that we have left, I'd like to ask you all for just a really quick thought about, again, bringing it back to the audience, everyone listening, and making them more of a united front in confronting cyber bad actors. What is the one thing that each of you knows, like friends of yours, family members do, that drives you crazy, that they should stop right now? Neil, do you want to start?
I'll start. Yeah, I'll start.
Oh, sorry, Secretary.
It's a little less of an issue right now because we're all in lockdown. But the two things that used to really bug me and still do are, one, people who use publicly available non-password protected Wi-Fi to send sensitive information. And second, when someone sends you an encrypted document by email and then sends you the encryption key in the next email, that doesn't achieve anything from a security standpoint. If you want to send the decryption key, send it using a different medium, or better yet, use the telephone.
I have the bank and a few different other offices that send me that sequence on a regular basis. So thank you for that. Ali, how about you? Well, why don't we, I'm not hearing Ali.
Can you hear me now?
There you are.
Can
yes.
you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, so the secretary mentioned what he did, and it's really great, and also what we heard at the beginning of the form, some of the recommendations regarding passwords and all these things. But one thing that really drives me crazy is, and I have it in my family, friends, a lot of people who, if they read it on Facebook, that it has to be true, and they repeat all false narratives. And this is regarding whatever. It's COVID, with 5G, with the anti-vaxxer movement. You go down the list of everything that has been now reported, and everything that all these radical groups, white supremacists or jihadis, they repeat and they amplify, and it's all based on false information. Again, think before you link. This is extremely important. Just because it's online, it does not mean, yeah.
Got it. And Neil and Liisa, in the 20 seconds you each have left, Neil, go.
So really summing up what the others have said, think before you do something online. And just because someone is expecting you or trying to pressure you to do something online, to click a link to download a document, doesn't mean you have to. You're in control.
Got it. And Liisa, last advice.
So many of my pet peeves have been mentioned already. Here's another one from people spending a lot of time online whilst being at home in lockdown. Give your sensitive data that makes you vulnerable for free, thinking it's entertainment. You know, these games where name your favorite childhood pet and the street you grew up on, well, those are actually password hint questions you've answered somewhere. Why do you give it away for free? And similarly, posting your childhood and current picture next to each other is just giving free facial recognition training data specifically for aging algorithms for AI. Why do you do that to yourself? You could just as well put the bullseye on your back.
Fantastic. I think people will be changing some things on their social media after this panel. With that, I'd like to thank all of our panelists for a thought-provoking discussion and their patience with the technical wonders of doing this virtually. And I'd now like to hand over next to Brussels, to Ms. Kinga Redzlowska of the Royal United Services Institute and her presentation on the CRAAFT project. Thank you.
Kim, thank you for the opportunity to present Project CRAAFT, an initiative for those who are interested in financing terrorism. Project CRAAFT, which stands for Collaboration, Research and Analysis Against Financing Terrorism, is academic research and community building initiative designed to promote a stronger, more cooperative approach towards counterterrorism financing capacities in the European Union and its neighborhood. My name is Kinga Redzlowska. I worked at RUSI and I'm CRAAFT project manager. Project CRAAFT brings together public authorities and private entities. Globsec, University of Amsterdam and ICCT at The Hague are the partners of the project. You may ask what Project CRAAFT can bring to me. Well, first of all, a bunch of workshops, webinars, and research briefings on topics such as new technologies and terrorism financing, lone actor and small cell terrorism, crime and light weapons as a source of terrorism financing, public-private data sharing, and last but not least, about capacities in Central and Eastern Europe and the Western Balkans. In this last field, Globsec is the leading partner. The idea behind it is to promote effective responses to terrorism financing in the Western Balkans by drawing on from the experience of Central and Eastern Europe. In 3 years, we want to build a trusted network of partners. If you want to join this network, please start with following us on Twitter and LinkedIn, where you will learn about the latest workshops, webinars, and research briefings. At Project CRAAFT is our Twitter channel. projectcraft.eu is our website. Kim, thank you for this opportunity. And Globsec audience, thank you as well. I wish you a good afternoon, and I hope you will enjoy the next Globsec panel. Thank you very much.
Globsec Bratislava Forum is the platform to tackle disruption and discuss solutions for better tomorrows.
Basic theme of disruption is crucial because, to me, the issue is not whether it's climate change or whether it's the Chinese or the Russians or whatever. It's actually the concatenation, the mix of them all. And that's